Today I want to talk about how I read over 100 books per year while being pretty busy. So, I live a pretty busy life. Let me give you an example let me just tell you about yesterday. Yesterday I woke up at 3:30 in the morning where I sat down, I was getting ready for work, recorded a video, went to work, worked 10-hour shift. Luckily at my job I get 1 hour of PT, so 9 hours working, 1 hour gym, which I get paid for as part of my employment. After that, I then drove home, and I have 40 to 50 minute commute home, so long drive out to the country because I live out in the country. I work in town, and then when I started driving, instead of going home, I went to fire training because I'm on my local volunteer fire department. So I ate dinner with them, and then I did volunteer fire training for another 2 hours, and then I got home at about 8 o'clock. Got home, laid down, talked to my family, and went to bed. That was my day yesterday. So as you can see, I live a pretty busy life. Yesterday was busier than most days because I usually don't have fire training, but I usually at least get up at 4:30 in the morning every morning to get ready for work, get everything ready in the morning, and then go to work. I start work at 6 in the morning and then work 10-hour shift. So I live a busy life, but I still am able to read over 100 books per year. So how do I do that? Well, the secret to how I read over 100 books per year, and some people will disagree with this, but I count listening to audiobooks as reading. Now, I don't only listen to audiobooks, I also read. But the first way that I've been able to increase the amount of books that I'm able to read in the wide sense, not in the physical reading sense, but in obtaining the information within the books, is by listening to audiobooks. I have a long commute to work. I have about a 40 to 50 minute commute to work. So that gives me almost 2 hours per day, a little bit less, that I can listen to audiobooks while I'm driving. So that's 2 hours per day. At my work, I work in a job, I do maintenance work, and a lot of it is work where I can use headphones and I can listen to books while I'm working. So on top of that, that adds another 10 hours per day that I have the capability to, sorry, something was popping up on my phone, which I'm recording this with, but that gives me a couple hours per day that I'm able to, up to 10 hours per day, plus the 2 hour commute almost. And obviously I can't listen to the book for 10 hours, but realistically I can at least listen to the book for at least another 4 hours per day if I felt like that. I don't always listen to 6 hours of, audiobook per day. But the first way that I do it is I'm able to just pack in books by just listening to them while I'm at work, listening to them on headphones, listening to them while I'm at home doing chores, taking care of the animals, because I also live on a homestead, so we have animals that have to be taken care of. Luckily, I have a lot of family around, so they also can do a lot of that because they know that I'm quite busy. But, so the first way is just listening to audiobooks, finding time to cram in audiobooks, because there's a lot of small periods in your day where you might not be able to sit down and physically read, but you may have the time and you may be able to actually listen to books. That's my first way, and that's the most major way. Now, because my time is very limited, I still like to read, because there are advantages to physically reading books that you don't get from listening to the audiobook. You can't read a text in the same level of deepness that you can get from listening to the audiobook. Listening to the audiobook is kind of like a middle level, where you get the story, and you get it about as much as if you just read the text normally. But you aren't going to be able to have a pencil in your hand underlining things that you see. You aren't going to be exegeting the text in the same way. You're not going to be able to. So let me give an example here. I've done a little bit of studying in biblical studies, and when you're exegeting a biblical text, there's a lot that goes into that, because first of all, you're going to be looking at the actual historical context of the book that you're reading, and then you're going to have to look at the historical, not just the historical context, but also literary context that is within the passage that you're reading. And then if you're a Christian and you're religious, you're also going to want to look at the wider theological context of how this, how does this interact with all the other texts in the Bible? How does this work with this? And how does this interact with other texts within the book? How do we make sense of this text saying one thing and this other text saying another thing, and they seem on the surface possibly to not necessarily contradict, but to push up against each other? How do we put these two texts together? And that's part of the theological discipline of reading a text deeply. But that takes a lot of work, and you have to read very slowly. And you also have to, depending on if you're reading an ancient text, look at historical context, obviously, and possibly even look at original language. If you have the skill, obviously, you can just read the original language directly. If not, you can use, certain study tools that can also assist you in looking at the original language and looking at the studies of other scholars who understand the language better than you do. So you do want to have certain times when you can actually properly sit down and read a book deeply. So what I do is I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and then when a book is really, really good, or it's really, really worthwhile, or I need to study it for some reason for school, for papers that I'm writing. Oh yeah, I also forgot to mention that I'm also in college full-time. That's another thing that I do. But, so what I do is, I will read books that are really, really good. So if I've listened to a book, I've decided I love this book is great, and there's a lot of depth in it, I will then go back to sections of the book that I listened to that I thought, this is a really key section, I want to understand this better, I want to understand this part more deeply. Then I will go into the book and I will buy a physical copy of it, and I will read that section of the book. Sometimes it'll be the whole book, but often it'll just be certain sections that are very important. And then I'll really get deep into exegeting it. I'll be underlining and all, writing side notes while I'm studying, and it just depends on how deep I really want to go into it. And sometimes I also just like to physically read when I get my free time. Like right before bed is a really good time to read. So you spend a lot of time, I do, unfortunately, scrolling on your phone and doing stuff that really isn't optimal for your mental health or for your dopamine or anything like that. So what you can do to actually fix that is when you lay down at night to read, when you lay down at night, that's actually a great time to read. So start bringing in reading when you have some free time, especially when you want to, relax and start calming down your mind from a busy day. Instead of bringing in all the craziness of watching videos on your phone, you can, especially shorts and things like that, you can actually just take a book and start reading the book properly. So that's how I generally read up to 100 books per year. Now, I would also like to make note that the amount of books that you read is really a stupid way to quantify how good you are at reading. It's not really a great way of doing that. So that would be incorrect to assume that. Sorry, there's people walking by, I was waving at them. But it would be incorrect to assume that the only way to properly say that you're a good reader is by how many books you read. Because one person could read the book of Jude, which is the book in the Bible. It's one chapter. You could read that book 100 times. You could do that in a day if you spent all day working at it. You could just reread Jude 100 times. You could say, I've read 100 books. I mean, you'd be reading the same book, but you could say, in some sense, I've read 100 books per year because I read the book of Jude, which is one chapter. Or you could read something like the Summa Theologica, which is a massive multi-volume writing by Thomas Aquinas. And when you read that book, and, there's obviously a huge difference between reading one chapter, a book that's one chapter, and reading the Summa Theologica, which is a book that will probably take you months alone to read that book by itself. Or, there's a big difference between something less extreme, would be like a Louis L'Amour novel, which I love, or reading The Count of Monte Cristo. Obviously, The Count of Monte Cristo is going to be like 5 or 6 times as long as one average Louis L'Amour novel. So when you look at the difference, it's kind of stupid to say, well, I read, 10 Louis L'Amour novels and you read one, The Count of Monte Cristo. Honestly, the person who read The Count of Monte Cristo probably still had the deeper, more, and not to say that Louis L'Amour is bad, but, the person who read The Count of Monte Cristo should gain a little bit more respect in their reading ability in some sense than the guy who read, just a bunch of Louis L'Amour novels, because the more difficult text is a much longer text. It's a much more historically rich text, I suppose you could say in some sense. It's more of a classic than the Louis L'Amour books. Not to down on Louis L'Amour, though. I love Louis L'Amour. I mean, I'm an American country boy. So the things that I would recommend to do is find times when you can listen to books, because even though you might be really busy, you probably have time to listen to books. And the other thing that I'd like to say is find time when normally you're scrolling or watching TV and you're doing something that isn't productive, or you're not with your family, or you're trying to wind down, and use that time to physically read, because there are advantages, and you want to physically read if you can, and listen to audiobooks. I think there's great advantages to both, and I think having a mix of both is really valuable. But for really busy people, audiobooks, in my personal experience, have been the way that I have been able to just read way, way more than most people while being way, way busier than most people. So thank you for watching. If you liked this video, you can do whatever the YouTube crap is that, whatever they want you to do to make me rich and famous. So have a good day. Bye.